All right, settle in, get comfortable. Tonight we're going somewhere very, very old. And I mean old, old. Not my grandparents had a rotary phone old. We're talking ancient Rome old, around 100 AD, give or take a century. And before you picture gladiators and toga parties and Russell Crowe covered in sand, stop. That's not where we're going tonight. Tonight we're going to the version of Rome that actually existed for most people. The quiet version. The one happening on a side street somewhere while Julius Caesar was busy being Julius Caesar. The Rome of ordinary people, ordinary mornings, and extraordinarily complicated family dynamics. So take a breath, let your shoulders drop, and come with me.
The sun is just coming up over the hills east of the city, and right now, Rome looks almost peaceful. Almost. The sky is shifting from deep blue to something pale and golden, and the rooftops of the city are catching the first light, terracotta and marble, and the occasional optimistic attempt at a garden on a second-floor ledge. If you were floating above it all right now, you'd see a city that is genuinely enormous for its time. Over 1 million people live here. 1 million people in a city with no electricity, no plumbing in most apartments, and no coffee. Honestly, respect to everyone involved. Come down into the streets now. You're standing on a narrow stone-paved road, and when I say narrow, I mean 2 people with shopping bags would have a genuinely awkward time passing each other. The stones underfoot are large and irregular, worn smooth by centuries of sandals, cartwheels, and the occasional very confused donkey. The street is mostly empty right now. Shutters are closed. A clay jar sits outside a doorway, like someone meant to bring it in last night and simply did not. The city has that specific quiet that only exists right before everything gets loud again.
There's a fountain nearby. Actually, there are fountains everywhere in ancient Rome because the Romans built aqueducts that carried fresh water from the hills into the city continuously, day and night, which means the city is never completely silent. There's always water somewhere. The one near you is just a stone basin with a carved spout, nothing fancy, but the water coming out of it has traveled miles through stone channels to get here, which is honestly more impressive than most things happening on this street right now. It sounds like a slow, steady trickle, very soothing. You're welcome.
The first sounds of the city are starting to filter in. A cart somewhere, a few streets over, that distinctive wooden wheel on stone sound that Romans apparently found completely normal, but would drive a modern person absolutely wild within 20 minutes. A horse. A voice calling out something you can't quite make out. A shutter banging open above you. These sounds arrive one at a time, like the city is testing them out before committing to a full morning. Which, fair enough. Nobody wants to go full noise before sunrise. Even a city of 1 million people deserves a gentle start.
Look up. On both sides of this street, apartment buildings, the insulae, rise 5, 6, sometimes 7 stories above you. They are close together, very close. Close enough that people on opposite upper floors could, and occasionally did, have arguments without raising their voices much. Most Romans live in these buildings, stacked on top of each other in small apartments that are basically 1 or 2 rooms per family. No private kitchen, fire risk was too high. No private toilet, there were public latrines for that, which is a whole other conversation. What they did have was proximity to their neighbors, whether they wanted it or not, and most of them did not.
A few streets over, behind a plain exterior wall, there's a domus, a private townhouse belonging to a family with actual money. Step through the entrance corridor, and suddenly you're in a completely different world. There's an atrium, a central room with a rectangular pool in the middle, open to the sky above, columns along the sides, walls painted in soft terracotta and green. It's quiet in here, cool. A household servant is moving through on some early morning task, and a small shrine in the corner still has yesterday's offering on it. This house belongs to the kind of family that has opinions about other families' marriage choices. We'll be spending a lot of time with families like this one. Let's walk toward the Forum. You can feel it before you see it, a kind of gravitational pull toward the center of everything. The Forum is where Rome does its business: legal disputes, political speeches, religious ceremonies, commercial deals, and a truly impressive amount of public gossip. At this hour, it's almost empty, which is the only time it ever looks the way the architects intended: grand, spacious, the stone paving stretching between temple facades and colonnaded basilicas. In about 2 hours it will be absolutely packed, but right now it's just you and the pigeons and the long morning shadows of columns stretching across the ground. There's a temple on the north side of the Forum, 8 columns across the front, tall and white, steps leading up that are worn slightly concave in the center from foot traffic. The door is closed. Inside, in the dark, the cult statue of whatever god this temple belongs to is doing what cult statues do, standing very still and being very impressive. Romans had a lot of gods, a lot, and they took the maintenance of their relationships with those gods quite seriously, because the gods could, if sufficiently annoyed, make your harvest fail, your ship sink, or your marriage go badly. So you kept up the offerings. It was basically an insurance policy with better architecture. Something reaches you now that changes the whole morning: the smell of fresh bread. There's a bakery nearby, a pastrina, and they have been awake since well before dawn, because Romans did not bake at home. Most people in the insulae had no safe place for a cooking fire, so every morning they brought their bread from the bakery, still warm, the same way a modern person grabs a coffee on the way to work. The baker is already done with his first batch, round loaves scored across the top. Archaeologists have actually found these perfectly preserved in Pompeii, still sitting in the oven exactly where they were left 2,000 years ago. The smell this morning is warm and yeasty and deeply, deeply human. The workers are coming out now. A baker sweeping his threshold with a short broom, the same 8 strokes in the same pattern every morning. So automatic he could do it in his sleep, and probably has. A street cleaner working his way along the gutter. A shopkeeper lifting the heavy wooden shutter off his storefront with a bang that startles the pigeons from the roof above. Nobody is moving fast. It's early. The city is warming up, not running yet. There's something very comforting about watching people do their ordinary morning routines, the same way people have been doing them every morning, in every city, in every era. Different century, same energy. Your father is thinking about all of this while you're playing in the courtyard. Specifically, he's thinking about reputation, his family's reputation, which is the currency that Roman social life runs on. A good family name, properly maintained through respectable behavior, advantageous marriages, and the right social connections, was an asset that could open doors for generations. A bad marriage, one that brought shame or financial ruin or the wrong social associations, could damage that reputation in ways that were very hard to repair. So when your father evaluates potential matches for his children, he is not just thinking about whether the other family is nice. He is thinking about their history, their debts, their connections, their social standing, and whether an alliance with them will help or hurt the family position. It's chess, very long-term chess, with people as the pieces. Your mother has her own set of calculations running in parallel. She knows things your father doesn't: the social intelligence of the neighborhood, the whispered information network that operated through women's social spaces, the spinning bees and household visits and neighborly conversations that moved a different kind of information than the forum did. She knows which families are in quiet financial trouble despite appearances. She knows whose son has a temper. She knows whose daughter has a reputation that doesn't quite match the official story. This information mattered enormously in a world where official records were sparse and social reputation was everything. Your mother was, without any formal title, a significant intelligence operation. Meanwhile, you, the child at the center of all these calculations, are largely unaware of most of this. You're learning your letters, you're arguing with your siblings, you're trying to get the dog to do something impressive and failing. You have opinions about food and strong feelings about which of your friends is actually your best friend, and a general sense that the adults around you are busy with things you don't quite understand yet. Which is fair. You're 7. The marriage planning your parents are doing right now won't directly affect your daily life for several more years, but it's happening. The conversations are being had. The options are being mentally cataloged. By the time you're old enough to understand what's being arranged, a significant portion of it will already have been decided.
Let's talk about siblings for a moment, because the dynamics inside a Roman household were genuinely complicated by the question of birth order and gender. Older sons carried more expectation. They were being groomed for public life, for the family business, for eventually inheriting the paterfamilias role. Younger sons had more freedom, but also less security. Daughters, regardless of birth order, were viewed primarily through the lens of the marriages they could make, which families they could connect you to, which alliances their dowries could secure. And if a family had limited resources and too many children, the calculations got harder. Rome was not sentimental about resource allocation in ways that a modern family would be. One thing that surprises people is how much Romans genuinely cared about their children. Not in a hands-off, formal, emotionally distant way. There is real evidence in letters and inscriptions and surviving poetry that Roman parents loved their children with the full, complicated, worried intensity of parents anywhere and in any era. Gravestones for children who died young are among the most heartbreaking objects archaeologists have found, written with love and grief that needs no translation across 2,000 years. The paterfamilias system gave fathers enormous legal power over their families, but the actual emotional reality of Roman family life seems to have been considerably warmer than the law code suggests. People are, it turns out, not just their legal frameworks. By the time you're 12 or 13, things start to shift. The training wheels come off in various ways. Boys in well-off families underwent the toga virilis ceremony, the formal transition to adulthood, marked by replacing the child's toga with an adult one. The exact age varied. The paterfamilias decided when you were ready, but it was usually somewhere between 14 and 17. This was a real ceremony, a trip to the forum with your family, the dedication of your childhood bulla, a protective amulet worn since infancy, to the household gods, the donning of the adult toga, and from that day forward you were legally a Roman man. Congratulations! You now had adult responsibilities, and your father still owned everything. For girls, the transition marker was different. It was marriage itself, or at least betrothal. The life of a married woman began when she left her father's household to join her husband's. Before that, she was under her father's authority. After, she was under her husband's, or in some forms of marriage, technically remained under her father's, which was its own complicated legal arrangement that Roman lawyers spent a great deal of time sorting out. The point is, adulthood for a Roman girl was not an age exactly, or a ceremony with a toga. It was a status change. It was marriage, which meant that everything leading up to marriage was, in a very real sense, preparation for the main event. So this is the world you've grown up in,
A world where your family's reputation is a living asset that requires maintenance, where your father's authority is total and legally backed, where your future marriage is being planned with the same seriousness your father brings to his business dealings, where your education, depending on your gender, is specifically designed to prepare you for a role that has already been largely defined. And yet, within all of this structure, within all these rules and expectations and calculations, Roman people fell in love, wrote each other poetry, argued passionately for the person they wanted, made their parents' lives complicated in the age-old tradition of children who have met someone and will not be talked out of it. The system was rigid. People were not.
The fire in the household shrine is burning low. Your father is in the tablinum, his home office, going over something on a wax tablet with the focused expression of a man doing arithmetic he doesn't entirely like the results of. Your mother is in the inner rooms, talking in a low voice with the woman next door who stopped by an hour ago and has shown no signs of leaving. Your siblings are somewhere arguing about something. The house is doing what houses do in the evening, settling into itself, the sounds of the city outside going quieter, the smells of dinner still in the air. You are in that specific state of childhood tiredness where you're not quite ready to admit you're tired. The lamp is warm, the courtyard is cooling, and somewhere in your father's careful mental accounting, the question of your future is being turned over quietly, like a coin examined in lamplight. But that's tomorrow's story. For now, settle in, let your breath go slow. The night is here, and it's asking nothing of you. Sleep well.
So, you've been born into ancient Rome. Congratulations. This is either very good news or complicated news, depending entirely on one thing: who your father is. Not in a philosophical sense, in a completely literal, legally binding sense. Because in ancient Rome, your father isn't just your dad. He is the pater familias, the father of the family, and he has absolute authority over every single person in your household. His wife, his children, his grandchildren, his great-grandchildren, everyone. All of them legally under his power until the day he dies. Which, given Roman life expectancy, might actually not be that far away. But still, until that day, his house, his rules, his decisions. No appeals, no HR department. And when I say absolute authority, I want to be clear that Roman law took this seriously. The paterfamilias had something called patria potestas, paternal power, which technically included the legal right to disown his children, sell them into slavery, or, in the early Republic at least, sentence them to death. Now, by 100 AD, most Romans were not actually doing that last one on a regular basis, but the legal framework was still there, sitting quietly in the background like a very severe reminder that Dad's opinion on things was not optional. You could disagree with the paterfamilias, you just had to do it carefully and probably not out loud. Here is the other thing about paterfamilias that catches modern people off guard. It lasted forever. Or rather, it lasted until he died. A Roman man could be 40 years old, running his own household, managing his own business, and he still legally did not own the property he lived in if his father was still alive. His income, technically, belonged to his father. He received an allowance, a peculium, to manage his own affairs, but the underlying authority never transferred until death. So if your grandfather lived to 90, your father was still, legally speaking, a dependent until he was 60-something. Rome had a word for everything, but awkward family dinner doesn't appear to have been one of them. You are a child in this household now. Let's say you're about 6 or 7. Your world is small and specific. The rooms of your home, the street outside, the neighbors you know by face, the smells of the kitchen and the courtyard. Roman children had toys, actual toys. Archaeologists have found them. Clay dolls, toy weapons, rattles, balls, wooden hoops, little carved animals. Dogs were common pets, so were birds. The children of wealthy families had slaves assigned specifically to look after them, a pedagogus, a kind of guardian escort who walked them to school, stayed with them during lessons, and was responsible for their behavior. The pedagogus had authority to correct the children in his care. So at age 7, you were answering to your father, your mother, and also technically the household slave whose job it was to keep you in line. Hierarchy all the way down.
School, if your family could afford it, started around age 7. You went to a ludus, a basic school run by a teacher called a literator, where you learned reading, writing, and arithmetic. You wrote on wax tablets with a stylus, which is exactly as satisfying as it sounds and probably also as messy. Class sizes were small. The classroom was often just a rented room or even an outdoor space. And the teaching method was essentially the teacher says a thing, you repeat it until you know it. Memorization was the entire curriculum. The Romans were not big on learning through discovery. You learned through repetition, and if you got it wrong, the switch came out. Education in ancient Rome had a very clear feedback loop.
But here is where the path splits, and it splits early and it splits decisively. Around age 11 or 12, the experience of growing up in a Roman family diverged dramatically based on one variable, whether you were a boy or a girl. Boys from good families continued their education. They moved to a grammaticus, a grammar school, where they studied Latin, Greek, literature, and eventually rhetoric. Because in Rome, the ability to speak persuasively in public was not a nice skill to have. It was the skill. It was the whole point. Everything in Roman public life, law, politics, business, ran on argument. If you couldn't speak well, you were at a permanent disadvantage. So boys practiced constantly. Girls went home. That's the short version. The longer version is the girls around 11 or 12 transitioned from whatever basic education they had received into learning how to run a Roman household, how to manage slaves, oversee the kitchen, handle the household accounts, spin and weave, and present themselves appropriately in social situations. This was not considered a lesser education, to be clear. Romans genuinely believed that a well-run household required significant skill and intelligence, and the domina, the mistress of the house, had real authority within her domain. But that domain had walls, literal ones mostly. The public world outside the house was not hers to operate in, at least not in the same way it was her brother's. Meanwhile, everyone in the household, boys, girls, slaves, freedmen, the whole extended structure, participated in the daily religious life of the family. The household gods, the lares and penates, had their own shrine in the home, usually in or near the atrium, and the pater familias presided over daily offerings and prayers to them. These weren't optional. They were as routine as breakfast. Every morning, a small offering, a bit of food, some incense, a simple ritual, and then the day could begin. The gods were understood to be interested in the specific well-being of your specific household, and keeping them happy was basic maintenance, like feeding the dog. Except the dog could not cause your crops to fail if you forgot. Now, let's talk about what your parents are thinking about while you're busy with your wax tablet and your toy dog. Because here's the thing. From almost the moment you were born, your parents had opinions about who you were going to marry. Not like vague hopes, actual plans. Roman families in the upper and middle classes treated marriage as an alliance, a negotiation between two families with mutual interests, involving reputation, money, social status, and political connections. Your personal feelings on the matter were noted. They were not necessarily the deciding factor. And nobody thought this was strange, because this was simply how things worked. You had a role in the family's strategy. The sooner everyone was clear on that, the better for everyone. The legal marriageable age in Rome was 12 for girls and 14 for boys, which, yes, sounds alarming to modern ears, and historians are broadly in agreement that it was quite young, though evidence suggests most girls in practice married in their late teens rather than immediately at 12. Boys typically married a bit later, often in their late teens, early 20s. But the planning started much earlier than the actual wedding. A betrothal, a formal engagement, could be arranged when children were still young, essentially locking in the family's intentions and the financial terms while the actual marriage waited until the appropriate age. You could be engaged before you had finished school.
The dowry is the thing you have to understand if you want to understand Roman marriage negotiations. The bride's family provided a das, a dowry, to the groom's family at the time of marriage. This was not a small gift. For families with any means at all, the dowry was a significant transfer of wealth, and it was negotiated carefully with clear legal agreements about what happened to it if the marriage ended. Horace, the Roman poet, put it simply, "The great virtue of parents is a great dowry," which is a very Roman way of saying that love is nice, but financial security is better. The size of your dowry affected who would consider marrying you. It was, functionally, part of your value in the marriage market, which is uncomfortable to say, but is accurate. Your father is thinking about all of this while you're playing in the courtyard. Specifically, he's thinking about reputation, his family's reputation, which is the currency that Roman social life runs on. A good family name, properly maintained through respectable behavior, advantageous marriages, and the right social connections, was an asset that could open doors for generations. A bad marriage, one that brought shame or financial ruin or the wrong social associations, could damage that reputation in ways that were very hard to repair. So when your father evaluates potential matches for his children, he is not just thinking about whether the other family is nice. He is thinking about their history, their debts, their connections, their social standing, and whether an alliance with them will help or hurt the family position. It's chess, very long-term chess, with people as the pieces.
Your mother has her own set of calculations running in parallel. She knows things your father doesn't, the social intelligence of the neighborhood, the whispered information network that operated through women's social spaces, the spinning bees and household visits and neighborly conversations that moved a different kind of information than the forum did. She knows which families are in quiet financial trouble despite appearances. She knows whose son has a temper. She knows whose daughter has a reputation that doesn't quite match the official story. This information mattered enormously in a world where official records were sparse and social reputation was everything. Your mother was, without any formal title, a significant intelligence operation. Meanwhile, you, the child at the center of all these calculations, are largely unaware of most of this. You're learning your letters, you're arguing with your siblings, you're trying to get the dog to do something impressive and failing. You have opinions about food and strong feelings about which of your friends is actually your best friend, and a general sense that the adults around you are busy with things you don't quite understand yet. Which is fair. You're 7. The marriage planning your parents are doing right now won't directly affect your daily life for several more years, but it's happening. The conversations are being had. The options are being mentally cataloged. By the time you're old enough to understand what's being arranged, a significant portion of it will already have been decided. Let's talk about siblings for a moment, because the dynamics inside a Roman household were genuinely complicated by the question of birth order and gender. Older sons carried more expectation. They were being groomed for public life, for the family business, for eventually inheriting the paterfamilias role. Younger sons had more freedom, but also less security. Daughters, regardless of birth order, were viewed primarily through the lens of the marriages they could make, which families they could connect you to, which alliances their dowries could secure. And if a family had limited resources and too many children, the calculations got harder. Rome was not sentimental about resource allocation in ways that a modern family would be.
One thing that surprises people is how much Romans genuinely cared about their children. Not in a hands-off, formal, emotionally distant way. There is real evidence in letters and inscriptions and surviving poetry that Roman parents loved their children with the full, complicated, worried intensity of parents anywhere and in any era. Gravestones for children who died young are among the most heartbreaking objects archaeologists have found, written with love and grief that needs no translation across 2,000 years. The paterfamilias system gave fathers enormous legal power over their families, but the actual emotional reality of Roman family life seems to have been considerably warmer than the law code suggests. People are, it turns out, not just their legal frameworks.
By the time you're 12 or 13, things start to shift. The training wheels come off in various ways. Boys in well-off families underwent the toga virilis ceremony, the formal transition to adulthood, marked by replacing the child's toga with an adult one. The exact age varied. The paterfamilias decided when you were ready, but it was usually somewhere between 14 and 17. This was a real ceremony, a trip to the forum with your family, the dedication of your childhood bulla, a protective amulet worn since infancy, to the household gods, the donning of the adult toga, and from that day forward, you were legally a Roman man. Congratulations, you now had adult responsibilities, and your father still owned everything. For girls, the transition marker was different. It was marriage itself, or at least betrothal. The life of a married woman began when she left her father's household to join her husband's. Before that, she was under her father's authority. After, she was under her husband's, or in some forms of marriage, technically remained under her father's, which was its own complicated legal arrangement that Roman lawyers spent a great deal of time sorting out. The point is, adulthood for a Roman girl was not an age exactly, or a ceremony with a toga. It was a status change. It was marriage, which meant that everything leading up to marriage was, in a very real sense, preparation for the main event. So this is the world you've grown up in, a world where your family's reputation is a living asset that requires maintenance, where your father's authority is total and legally backed, where your future marriage is being planned with the same seriousness your father brings to his business dealings, where your education, depending on your gender, is specifically designed to prepare you for a role that has already been largely defined. And yet, within all of this structure, within all these rules and expectations and calculations, Roman people fell in love, wrote each other poetry, argued passionately for the person they wanted, made their parents' lives complicated in the age-old tradition of children who have met someone and will not be talked out of it. The system was rigid. People were not. The fire in the household shrine is burning low. Your father is in the tablinum, his home office, going over something on a wax tablet with the focused expression of a man doing arithmetic he doesn't entirely like the results of. Your mother is in the inner rooms, talking in a low voice with the woman next door who stopped by an hour ago and has shown no signs of leaving. Your siblings are somewhere arguing about something. The house is doing what houses do in the evening, settling into itself, the sounds of the city outside going quieter, the smells of dinner still in the air. You are in that specific state of childhood tiredness where you're not quite ready to admit you're tired. The lamp is warm, the courtyard is cooling, and somewhere in your father's careful mental accounting, the question of your future is being turned over quietly, like a coin examined in lamplight. But that's tomorrow's story. For now, settle in. Let your breath go slow. The night is here, and it's asking nothing of you. Sleep well. All right, you've survived childhood. Your wax tablet years are behind you. Your father's alarming legal authority over your entire existence is still very much in place, but at this point you've more or less accepted it the way you accept the weather. It's simply a condition of life, and you work around it. You are a young Roman adult now,
somewhere between 15 and 20, depending on your gender and your family's particular timeline for you. The city is fully alive around you every single day, and you are finally old enough to actually be in it, which is, after years of being managed and supervised and sent to bed at the appropriate hour, genuinely exciting. Welcome to the most socially complicated phase of Roman life. Try to keep your reputation intact. Your day starts early. Romans were morning people by necessity. There was no artificial lighting worth mentioning, which meant the rhythm of daily life was essentially dictated by the sun. You were up around dawn or shortly after. Breakfast was quick and modest by any standard. Some bread, maybe dipped in olive oil or wine, some olives, a piece of fruit if you had it. No eggs and toast, no coffee, nothing that required significant preparation. You ate standing up, probably, or sitting at the edge of the table while the household reorganized itself around you. Then you were out. The Roman day happened in the morning. By early afternoon, the serious social activity was already well underway. First stop, the Forum. The Forum was, depending on the time of day, a law court, a marketplace, a political arena, a social club, and a rumor exchange, all happening simultaneously in the same physical space. For a young Roman man starting to build his adult reputation, time at the Forum was not optional. This was where you were seen, where you greeted the right people, were greeted in return, and understood through the specific warmth or coolness of those greetings exactly where you stood socially at this particular moment. Rome ran on hierarchy, and the Forum was where that hierarchy was performed and updated every single day. You could learn more about your social standing from one morning at the Forum than from a week of thinking about it at home. For young women, the access to this particular social arena was more limited. Well-off Roman women were not expected to be loitering around the Forum making conversation with near strangers. Their social world was more bounded. The household, the neighborhood, the specific social events that respectable women attended, and the women's networks that operated through those spaces. This doesn't mean young Roman women were locked away. They absolutely moved through the city, went to the markets, attended religious festivals, visited neighbors, and participated in public life. But the casual, unstructured, just hanging around the Forum looking important move was primarily a male activity. The women had their own version of it. It just happened in different locations.
The baths. We need to talk about the baths. The thermae were, and I want to be precise here because this genuinely surprises people, essentially the Roman equivalent of a social club, a gym, a spa, and a community center all under one roof. And attending them was not a hygiene choice, it was a social obligation. You went to the baths every single day, not because Romans were obsessed with cleanliness, though they were, but because the baths were where you talked to people, where you heard what was happening, where deals were made and information was exchanged and friendships were maintained. Seneca the Younger famously complained about the noise from the baths below his apartment, the splashing, the grunting, the socializing. He was very annoyed. He also kept the apartment.
A typical Roman bath complex was considerably more than a place to wash. You came in, paid a small entrance fee, cheap enough for most people, left your clothes in a changing room that everyone understood was a theft risk, and moved through a sequence of rooms of increasing temperature: the frigidarium, cold, the tepidarium, warm, and the caldarium, hot. In between, you might exercise in the palestra, an open courtyard where men wrestled, ran, played ball games, and lifted weights. There were snack vendors, there was a library at some of the larger baths, there were shops. The whole experience could take 2 or 3 hours easily, which was apparently fine because the Roman workday was front-loaded into the morning and afternoons were considered appropriate for leisure. Now, the baths were also, and Roman historians noted this with varying degrees of approval, a place where you might notice someone you found interesting. The social mixing was real. You were in a warm room with other people in a state of relative informality, which created an atmosphere that the Forum, with its togas and careful greetings, simply did not.
Emperor Hadrian eventually separated the men's and women's bathing hours because things had gotten, in the official Roman opinion, too casual. But before and even somewhat after that reform, the baths remained one of the few places in Roman social life where the normal rigid categories of who could talk to whom were slightly more relaxed. Slightly. This is still ancient Rome. There were still rules. There were just fewer of them, temporarily, and everyone was clean. Festivals. Rome had an extraordinary number of them. By some counts, more than 40 official religious festivals in the Roman calendar year, each one dedicated to a specific god, agricultural event, or historical occasion. And festivals were not solemn affairs conducted at a respectful distance. They were public events, processions through the streets, communal banquets, theatrical performances, athletic competitions, music, gambling, temporarily legal during certain festivals, and enormous crowds of people, all in the same public spaces at the same time. For a young Roman navigating their social world, festivals were among the most important events of the year. They were one of the few occasions when people who wouldn't normally cross paths ended up in the same place at the same time. Lupercalia, on the 15th of February, is the one historians most often connect to modern Valentine's Day, though the actual connection is much more complicated than the greeting card industry would prefer. It was an ancient fertility festival involving priests, a goat, a whip made from its hide, and young men running through the streets hitting people, particularly young women, who considered being struck to be good luck for fertility and marriage. Yes, that was the festival. The Romans had a very different definition of romantic gesture. To be fair, it was enormously popular, it ran for centuries, and it clearly meant something significant to the people participating in it, even if the modern observer is mainly experiencing confusion. Saturnalia in December was the festival everyone actually looked forward to. It ran for 7 days. Normal social rules were suspended. Masters served their slaves. Gambling was legal for everyone, including children. Gifts were exchanged, and the general atmosphere was one of deliberate social inversion and communal celebration. People wore the felt cap of freedmen instead of their regular headgear, as a symbol that normal hierarchy was temporarily paused. It was the closest ancient Rome got to a full societal pause button, and Romans threw themselves into it with considerable enthusiasm. During Saturnalia, the usual careful management of social appearances that governed Roman public life was for one glorious week considerably less important than having a good time. Dinner parties, the cena, were the other major social arena of Roman adult life, and they deserve their own moment because they were genuinely central to how Romans of all classes built and maintained relationships. A Roman dinner party was not just eating, it was a performance. The guests mattered, who was invited, in what order they reclined, where at the table they were placed. All of this communicated the host's opinions about social hierarchy in ways that everyone present read perfectly well. There was food, wine, music, conversation, and sometimes entertainment. For wealthy hosts, the entertainment could be quite elaborate. For everyone else, the conversation was usually sufficient, because Romans were very good at it and considered it a social skill worth developing. The theater was another meeting place that historians of Roman social life keep returning to, because it was genuinely interesting as a social space. Roman theater was public and popular in a way that made it accessible to most of the city, not just the elite. The plays themselves ranged from serious drama to broad comedy, and Roman comedy was not shy. It dealt with love affairs, scheming slaves, confused identities, overprotective fathers, and young men trying to arrange romantic situations their families would not approve of, which was both entertainment and, one suspects, something of a manual for audiences of approximately the same age as the protagonists. The theater seated everyone by social rank, but it put them all in the same space, and the close quarters of a Roman theater created its own informal social mixing. Now, let's be honest about something. In all of these spaces, The forum, the baths, the festivals, the theater, the dinner parties, there was a very specific kind of social performance happening around the question of marriageability, because everyone in these spaces knew that this was the age when matches were being made and reputations were being established. Every time you appeared in public, you were being assessed. How you dressed, how you spoke, who greeted you back, whether you carried yourself with dignity, or whether you were the kind of person who made scenes or associated with the wrong crowd. Your social behavior in these spaces was, effectively, your application for the marriages your parents were negotiating and for the ones you might manage to influence yourself. The concept of dignitas, dignity, worth, reputation, was central to Roman social identity in a way that is hard to fully convey to a modern audience. For Romans, dignitas was real. It was a thing you had more or less of depending on your family, your behavior, your public conduct, and your social associations, and it had direct practical consequences. A person with good dignitas got favorable terms in business negotiations, got invited to the right dinners, got considered for advantageous marriages. A person who lost their dignitas through scandal, financial failure, or consistently poor social choices felt the consequences in every area of their life. It was not a metaphor, it was a currency. Which brings us to gossip. Oh, the gossip. Roman gossip was a serious social force, operated through every available channel simultaneously. The women's networks, the forum conversations, the bathhouse talk, the dinner party whisper circuit, and it moved fast. Faster, probably, than any official communication. The Roman satirist Juvenal complained about it at length, which tells you both that it was constant and that it was taken seriously enough to be worth complaining about in published poetry. What were people gossiping about? The same things people have always gossiped about. Who was spending more than they had? Whose marriage was in difficulty? Who had been seen talking to whom? Which family was putting on a better front than the reality justified? Sound familiar? Different city, same species. Young men had, in addition to all of this social navigation, a specific additional set of activities designed to prepare them for public life. Following an established public figure as a kind of apprentice, learning the law courts by observation, beginning to participate in legal or political life in small ways. Cicero famously described accompanying older men to the forum as a teenager, listening to speeches and legal arguments, beginning to understand how Roman public life actually functioned beneath its ceremonial surface. This period, between the toga virilis ceremony and the point when a young man had fully established himself as an independent adult, was a specific recognized life stage in Rome. It had its own social rules, it had its own expected behavior, and it was the life stage during which, increasingly, the question of marriage became something you were personally involved in, not just something happening to you. Young women's equivalent of this period looked different from the outside, but involved its own set of real skills. Managing a household as the domina required genuine administrative ability, overseeing slaves, managing food supplies and accounts, hosting guests appropriately, navigating the complex social dynamics of the neighborhood's women's networks, and presenting the household to the outside world in a way that maintained and ideally improved its reputation. None of this was passive, none of it was simple. A Roman woman who was genuinely good at running a household was running a small organization, and the skills required were as real as any her brother was developing in the forum. They were just applied in a different direction. And then there were the public gardens, the horti, large, planted, sometimes surprisingly private for a city of 1 million people. They offered something genuinely rare in Rome: space. Space to walk, to sit, to talk at a distance from the constant press of the city's noise and proximity. The gardens of Rome ranged from small neighborhood plantings to elaborate private estates open to the public by wealthy owners, and they were popular precisely because they provided a context for conversation that didn't have the formal weight of the forum or the noisy social performance of the baths. A walk in a garden was, within the appropriate supervisory context, one of the more relaxed social interactions a young Roman could have. Caesar reportedly used his gardens to host guests he particularly wanted to impress. The gardens were, in the specific social vocabulary of Rome, a statement. Here is what all of this amounts to, practically speaking. Being a young adult in ancient Rome meant living your life in public, constantly, with your reputation as the thing at stake. Every appearance was a performance. Every conversation was a social act with social consequences. Every choice about who you spent time with and where you went and how you presented yourself was being noted by someone who would eventually have an opinion about it that would reach your father's ears or your potential in-laws' ears or your neighbor's ears. The city was enormous. It felt intimate. 1,000,000 people who somehow all seemed to know everyone else's business, which was exhausting in some ways, and in other ways, because humans are social creatures who built cities specifically to be near other humans, it was exactly how people wanted to live, surrounded, seen, part of something. The afternoon light is going golden now. The baths are at their busiest, the afternoon crowd filling the warm rooms with steam and conversation. Somewhere across the city, a dinner party is being prepared, the slaves arranging the couches and the lamps and the dishes in the correct order of importance. At the forum, the last of the day's business is wrapping up, the advocates rolling their scrolls and the merchants covering their stalls. The day is tilting toward its quieter half. You are walking home through familiar streets, past the fountain that always sounds the same, past the bakery that is already sold out for the day, past the neighbor who nods at you with the expression of a man who knows more about your family than you'd ideally prefer. You nod back. Dignitas intact. Day complete. You're almost there. Let the city go quiet around you. Let the streets empty. Let the evening come in. The night is easy, and it's asking nothing of you at all. Sleep well. So here you are, a young Roman adult with a good enough reputation, a father with opinions, and a city full of other people in exactly the same situation. The question is, how did it actually happen? How did two Romans go from strangers to married? Because here is the thing that surprises most people when they actually look at this. There was no dating. No going on dates, no let's grab lunch and see how this goes. The Roman approach to finding a spouse was fundamentally different from anything a modern person would recognize, and yet somehow it produced marriages that lasted decades, generated genuine love poetry, and occasionally drove people completely to distraction. So let's walk through it, step by step, in the careful, supervised, family-approved Roman way. The first thing to understand is that in most Roman families with any social standing at all, you did not find your own spouse. Your family found your spouse. Or more precisely, your paterfamilias found your spouse, ideally with significant input from your mother, and then at some point involved you in a conversation that was more announcement than negotiation. This wasn't considered cruel or unusual. It was simply how things worked, and it had worked this way for generations, and the Romans were not in the habit of questioning systems that had produced an empire. The concept of marrying someone you had independently chosen yourself, based purely on personal feeling, was, in upper and middle-class Roman society, considered a little reckless, like choosing a business partner based entirely on whether they made you laugh. Sweet, also risky. So how did families find candidates? Mostly through networks they already had, the families you knew socially, the colleagues your father worked with or argued alongside in the courts, the neighbors whose household you'd been in dozens of times, the extended family connections that spread across the city and beyond. Roman society was deeply networked in the way that any pre-modern society is, where you knew perhaps a few hundred people well and perhaps a few hundred more by reputation, and the universe of possible matches was essentially drawn from that pool. You were, almost by definition, considering marrying someone whose family your family already knew, had known for some time, and had already formed opinions about.
Enter Ovid. Because we cannot talk about Roman courtship without talking about Ovid, the poet who wrote the Ars Amatoria, the art of love, essentially a manual for meeting and pursuing romantic interests in Rome, published around 1 BC. And Ovid's advice is useful here, not because it was typical Roman behavior, but because it tells us in vivid detail where people actually went and what they actually saw in those places. Ovid's top recommendation for meeting someone, the chariot races at the Circus Maximus. His reasoning, you're seated close together. It's socially acceptable to start a conversation. You can ask her name, ask her to support your team, reach past her to brush dust off her cloak. Ovid covers it all with a poet's enthusiasm and an extremely optimistic view of how often this worked.
The theater was Ovid's second recommendation, and he was quite specific about why. The seating placed people close together in a setting that already had an emotional charge. The plays dealt with love and conflict and passion, and the social norms were slightly more relaxed than in the forum. Ovid pointed out that a woman in a theater was by definition in a public space, and therefore technically available for respectful conversation, and that the shared experience of watching a performance gave you an immediate, easy topic. He was, in essence, writing the first recorded guide to conversation openers. The Emperor Augustus eventually passed laws restricting mixed-gender seating, partly in response to exactly this kind of thing, which suggests that Ovid's advice was being taken by a significant number of people.
Now, it is important to be clear, Ovid was not writing about finding a wife. He was writing about a different kind of romantic pursuit entirely, the kind that operated outside the official marriage system, in the complicated gray zone of Roman social life, where relationships existed that were not formal alliances, and not officially sanctioned by fathers, and not subject to dowry negotiations. That gray zone was real and widely acknowledged in Roman life. Roman love poetry, Catullus, Tibullus, Propertius, Ovid, is almost entirely about this kind of relationship, which tells you two things. One, Romans absolutely experienced intense romantic feelings, and two, the formal marriage system and the emotional reality of Roman love life were two somewhat separate tracks running alongside each other.
Back to the official track. For respectable families pursuing formal matches, the process began with conversation between fathers, or between a father and a trusted intermediary, a mutual friend, a family connection, someone who could approach the other family and sound out whether there was interest without anyone losing face if the answer was no. Face-saving was a major structural feature of Roman social negotiations. You did not make formal proposals that might be rejected publicly. You sent out feelers. You had conversations through intermediaries. You built toward a formal approach only when you had reasonable confidence that it would be received well. The whole process was designed to protect everyone's dignitas at every stage. If the initial soundings were positive, the families might arrange for the young people to meet, formally, in a supervised context, with family members present. This was not a date, this was an introduction. You might be seated at the same dinner party, or present at the same family gathering, or simply introduced in the atrium of one family's home with everyone watching. The conversation would be polite and careful because everyone in the room understood what this meeting was, and everyone was paying attention. You were, in essence, being interviewed for a role in someone else's family, while they were simultaneously being interviewed for a role in yours. The pressure was significant. The small talk was not that small. What were they actually looking for in these introductions? For a young man, the assessment covered his family reputation, his financial prospects, his education and ability to speak well, his general conduct, and whether he seemed like the kind of person who would manage a household responsibly. For a young woman, the assessment was focused on character, modesty, domestic capability, health, and the size of the dowry her family was prepared to offer. Neither party was being evaluated purely on personal charm, though personal charm certainly didn't hurt. It was a complete picture that was being assembled, the way you'd evaluate any significant long-term commitment, which is, when you think about it, not entirely unreasonable. Feelings fade. Finances don't lie.
Letters played a surprisingly important role in Roman courtship, particularly in the period between a match being identified and a formal betrothal being agreed. A young man interested in a young woman might write to her father, formally and carefully, expressing his interest and his family's intentions. But there was also a tradition of more personal correspondence, notes passed through trusted intermediaries, carried by slaves who could be relied upon to be discreet. Roman tablets for writing messages were small and wax-covered, easy to seal, easy to carry. The love poetry of the era is full of references to these notes, sealed, sent, received, reread by lamplight. The technology was different. The anxious waiting for a reply was completely identical.
The role of slaves in Roman courtship is something historians find genuinely interesting because it was so central and so rarely acknowledged in the official record. Trusted household slaves, particularly older women who had been with a family for years, functioned as go-betweens, carrying messages, conveying information, occasionally advocating for a match they personally approved of, or quietly discouraging one they didn't. They moved between households in ways that their owners could not, and they carried social intelligence that their owners depended on. The slave who had been with your family since before you were born, and who knew everyone in the neighborhood, was, in practical terms, one of the most useful assets in the courtship process. Nobody said this out loud. Everyone knew it. Religious festivals provided one of the most socially legitimate contexts for young people to be in the same space at the same time without the formal weight of a supervised introduction. At a festival, you were both there independently, both present for a religious occasion, both surrounded by enough other people that the encounter could be described afterward as coincidental, even if it absolutely was not. You might find yourself beside someone at a temple ceremony. You might pass the same person 3 times at the same Lupercalia procession. You might both happen to be near the same vendor selling the same festival food. These were not accidents. They were the Roman equivalent of engineering a casual encounter, executed with the complete sincerity of 2 people pretending they had not planned this at all. Now, Roman love poetry. Because we would be doing this story a serious injustice if we moved through the whole courtship process without stopping to acknowledge that Romans felt all of this extremely deeply and wrote about it in language that still stops people cold 2,000 years later. Catullus, writing in the 1st century BC, produced poems about love and longing and jealousy that a modern reader recognizes immediately, not as historical artifacts, but as exact descriptions of feelings they have personally had. His most famous opening lines to his beloved Lesbia, his fury when things went wrong, his inability to stop caring even when he wanted to, all of it is so immediate, so specific, so nakedly honest that the 2,000 years between him and us essentially disappear. People were people. They always were. There was also, it should be said, a strong tradition in Rome of men writing poetry as a courtship strategy. Not professionally published poetry, though Ovid did essentially turn romantic pursuit into a literary career, but the everyday practice of composing verses for someone you are interested in, having them delivered by a trusted intermediary, and waiting to see what came back. This was considered an acceptable, even admirable, demonstration of education and feeling. If you could write well enough to make someone laugh or sigh or both simultaneously, that was worth something. It demonstrated refinement. It demonstrated that you had paid attention in rhetoric class.
and it gave the recipients something that required no immediate response, which was a kindness given how carefully Roman women's reputations needed to be managed.
The role of mothers in the actual courtship process was considerable and mostly unrecorded. Officially, the paterfamilias made the decisions. In practice, Roman mothers who had spent years building the social intelligence networks we discussed earlier were doing significant behind-the-scenes work to shape which matches got seriously considered and which quietly did not. A mother who had heard, through 3 layers of neighborhood conversation, that a particular family's son had a drinking problem that he managed to hide in formal settings, could ensure that her family's consideration of that match ended before it began, without ever making that information official. This was influence without authority. It was genuinely effective, and it left almost no trace in the historical record, which is how influence without authority usually works.
What happened when a young person had strong feelings about someone their family had not selected? This was, predictably, a situation that Roman society had opinions about. The official position was that personal feelings were not irrelevant, but were also not the deciding factor. A well-raised Roman child understood that their marriage was a family matter and conducted themselves accordingly. The unofficial reality was considerably more varied. There are records of young Romans arguing passionately for a match their families opposed. There are records of elopements. There are records of matches that were eventually approved after enough persistent pressure from the young person involved. The system was rigid. People were persistent. These 2 facts produced a great deal of domestic trauma across several centuries.
The Circus Maximus deserves its own moment, because Ovid was not wrong. It was genuinely one of the most significant social spaces in Rome, capable of holding 200,000 spectators at its peak, which means it was by a considerable distance the largest gathering of people in the ancient world on any given race day. That is 200,000 people seated close together, sharing a common experience, shouting at the same horses for hours. The social barriers of normal Roman life, who you could appropriately approach, what conversation was acceptable between strangers, were somewhat suspended in the shared excitement of the races. Not eliminated, suspended. It was loud, it was exciting, and it was genuinely one of the few places where a young Roman of either gender might end up in extended proximity to someone they hadn't been formally introduced to. Ovid noticed. He took notes. By the time a young Roman had navigated all of these spaces and systems, the forum and the baths and the festivals and the dinner parties and the carefully engineered coincidental encounters, they were developing a sophisticated understanding of how Roman social life actually worked beneath its formal surface. They understood that the official rules and the actual practice were related but not identical. They understood that their father had the final authority and that their mother had the real information. They understood that their reputation was simultaneously their most fragile and most important possession. And they understood, from the love poetry and the gossip and the occasional glimpse of something real, that within all of these constraints, actual human feelings were happening, were always happening, quietly, persistently, in the spaces the rules left open.
Let's be honest about something else. The picture of Roman courtship that survives in the historical record is almost entirely the picture of wealthy, educated, upper-class Romans. We have their poetry, their letters, their legal documents, their funerary inscriptions. The courtship of ordinary Romans, the baker's daughter, the freedman's son, the family in the third-floor insula apartment, was probably considerably less formal, considerably less supervised, and considerably more driven by practical necessity and personal feeling than the elaborate negotiation we've been describing. We don't know exactly how they found each other, because they didn't leave the same kind of records, but they did find each other. The city was full of them. And they were doing what people do when they're young and in a city and alive. They were paying attention to each other.
It's late now. The circus has emptied, and the last of the race day crowd has dispersed into the evening streets.
Somewhere in the city, a man is rereading a note that came back today from someone he has been thinking about for weeks. Holding it close to the lamp to read it for the fourth time. Finding the same words he found the first 3 times, but needing to read them again anyway. Somewhere a father is having a careful, indirect conversation with a neighbor about families and futures and possibilities. Both of them pretending the conversation is about something else entirely, while understanding it perfectly well. Somewhere a young woman is asking a trusted slave what she actually thinks, and the slave is answering with considerably more honesty than the official household hierarchy would suggest was appropriate. The city is settling into night. The negotiations are pausing until morning, but the feelings don't pause. They never did. Let yours go quiet now. Let the lamplight go soft. Let the ancient city do what it always did at this hour. Breathe out. Slow down. And sleep. Sleep well.
All right, the feelers have been sent. The intermediaries have done their work. The mothers have exchanged enough information through enough layers of neighborhood conversation that both families have a reasonably accurate picture of what they're actually dealing with. The fathers have had their careful, indirect discussions that were officially about something else and unofficially about everything. And somewhere in the middle of all of this, somewhere between the first quiet mention of a name and the point where both families are genuinely interested, a decision has been made. Or rather, a series of small decisions has accumulated into one large one. It's time to make it official. Welcome to the Roman betrothal. It is more complicated than a modern engagement. It involves more paperwork, and it is, in its own way, genuinely moving. The formal betrothal, the sponsalia, was the official agreement between 2 families that a marriage would take place. It was not the marriage itself. It was the promise of the marriage, the legal and social commitment that the marriage was coming, binding on both families in a way that carried real social weight, even though technically a betrothal could be broken without the legal consequences of dissolving an actual marriage. In practice, breaking a betrothal was serious business. It required justification, it damaged reputations, it generated exactly the kind of gossip that Roman families spent enormous energy trying to avoid. You did not enter a sponsalia lightly, and you did not exit one without consequences. Who actually conducted the betrothal negotiation? The fathers, primarily, or their legal representatives if the father was absent or deceased. The discussion covered several things simultaneously: the confirmation that both parties were legally free to marry, the agreement on the dowry amount and its terms, the timeline for the actual wedding, and the various practical arrangements around property and household management that Roman law required to be explicit. This was, in other words, a legal and financial negotiation dressed in social ceremony. Rome was extremely good at this combination. They did it constantly. They had turned the blending of law and ceremony into something of an art form. The dowry negotiation deserves its own moment because it was genuinely central to everything. The das, the dowry, was the financial contribution the bride's family made to the new household, and its size was a direct reflection of the bride's family's financial standing and their estimation of the match's worth. A larger dowry signaled a more valuable alliance, a family of greater means, and a higher level of commitment to making the marriage work financially. The negotiations over the dowry were conducted seriously, with lawyers involved at the higher social levels, and the final agreement was documented. If the marriage later ended in divorce, which, as we will discuss, was not uncommon in Rome, the rules about what happened to the dowry were very specific and very important. Money had memory in ancient Rome. It always does.
There was a ceremony attached to the betrothal, not as elaborate as the wedding itself, but real and socially significant. The families gathered, witnesses were present, and the agreement was formalized through a ritual act. The most common description involves the father of the groom asking the father of the bride whether he gave his daughter in marriage, and the father of the bride answering that he did. Simple words, but spoken in front of witnesses, in the context of the full family and social network of both parties, they carried the weight of a public commitment. Rome understood that the difference between a private conversation and a public one was the difference between a wish and an obligation.
The betrothal ring, the annulus pro nubis, was given at the ceremony. It was placed on the third finger of the left hand, which Romans believed contained a nerve or vein that ran directly to the heart, the vena amoris, the vein of love. This, somewhat remarkably, the origin of the engagement ring tradition that still exists today, worn on the same finger for the same stated reason, in cultures that have largely forgotten where the custom came from. The ring itself was typically iron in earlier periods, plain, practical Roman, and gold in later and wealthier contexts. It was not primarily a romantic symbol. It was a marker of status change, a public sign that this person was spoken for, that the negotiation was complete, that the social and legal machinery of marriage was now in motion.
Let's talk about what the young people themselves were feeling during all of this, because the historical record, as usual, gives us more access to what the fathers were arranging than what the young people were experiencing. But we have some windows in. Letters from the period, particularly from educated Romans, suggest a range of responses. Some genuine excitement about a match they approved of, some resigned acceptance of a match that seemed reasonable if not thrilling, some quiet anxiety about leaving one household for another, and occasionally, the evidence for this is real though sparse, some genuine unhappiness about a match they had not wanted and had been unable to prevent. The system accommodated all of these responses in the same way. It moved forward regardless. Pliny the Younger, the Roman writer and lawyer who lived in the 1st and 2nd centuries AD, left behind a collection of letters that gives us some of the most vivid personal writing about Roman marriage from the inside. He wrote warmly and in detail about his young wife Calpurnia, about her intelligence, her interest in his work, her habit of reading his speeches in his absence. He was considerably older than she was, as was common in Roman marriages, and his letters suggest a genuine tenderness that doesn't read like performance. He missed her when they were apart. He worried about her health. He was proud of her. This is not the picture of a purely transactional arrangement. It is the picture of two people who had been placed in a marriage by their families and had, inside that arrangement, found something real.
The period between betrothal and wedding, which could be weeks or months, or in some cases years, depending on the ages of the parties and the arrangements being made, had its own social texture. The betrothed couple might see each other occasionally in supervised contexts. They might exchange gifts. There was a tradition of the groom sending gifts to his future wife during the betrothal period. Not elaborate romantic gestures necessarily, but items of practical and symbolic value that announced to the neighborhood that the arrangement was progressing and that both parties were investing in it. These gifts were noted. They were talked about. Everything in Rome was talked about. The mothers, during the betrothal period, were doing something that the historical record mostly doesn't name, but that was absolutely happening. They were preparing their children for the transition. The mother of the bride was helping her daughter understand what her life in a new household would require. The mother of the groom was in her own way preparing her son for the responsibilities of heading a household, managing a wife and her dowry, and representing the family publicly as a married man with standing. These were real conversations, real transfers of knowledge and expectation happening in the domestic spaces that the historical record barely reaches. But you can infer them from the outcomes. Roman marriages, for all their arranged alliance origins, functioned. The preparation worked. There was also a significant legal dimension to betrothal that had nothing to do with romance and everything to do with citizenship. Roman law was very specific about who could marry whom. Citizens could only contract a legal marriage, a justum matrimonium, with other citizens, or with those who had been granted the legal right to do so. Slaves could not legally marry. Freed slaves occupied a complicated middle ground. Soldiers in active service were, for a significant period of Roman history, legally prohibited from contracting marriages at all, which did not prevent them from forming long-term partnerships, but did affect the legal status of their children. The bureaucracy of Roman marriage was genuinely extensive. Rome ran on law. Even love had paperwork. Let's talk about the Auspices, because Rome was not going to let a major life event happen without consulting the gods about timing. Weddings, and by extension the betrothal agreements that established their timing, were subject to augury, the practice of determining whether the gods approved of an action based on the observation of birds, celestial events, and other signs. Certain months were considered unlucky for marriage. May in particular had a bad reputation, connected to the festival of the dead, and certain days within lucky months were preferable to others. A Roman family planning a wedding was simultaneously planning around religious constraints, family schedules, agricultural calendars, and the practical availability of the people involved. It was logistically complex in ways that would exhaust a modern wedding planner. June was the preferred month for Roman weddings, associated with Juno, the goddess of marriage, and within June, the days after the Ides, the 15th, were considered particularly auspicious. This preference was so consistent that it became culturally embedded, and the association of June with weddings has persisted in various forms through 2,000 years of subsequent cultural history into a world that no longer worships Juno and has largely forgotten why June seemed like a good idea. Culture has a long memory. It stores things in habits and preferences long after the original reasons have been lost. The betrothal period was also, practically speaking, the time when the physical and material preparations for the new household were being made. Where would the couple live? If they were joining the groom's family household, the existing domestic arrangements needed to accommodate a new person. If they were establishing their own household, which happened particularly in urban Rome, a suitable space needed to be found and furnished. The dowry funds were being allocated, the household goods were being assembled. Slaves, if any, were being assigned. This was the Roman equivalent of apartment hunting and IKEA trips simultaneously, conducted within the social and legal framework of an alliance negotiation. It was, by any measure, a lot of things happening at once. And then there was the question of the wedding date itself. Once agreed, the date was set with some ceremony. It was announced to the relevant social circles, which in Rome meant it became neighborhood knowledge within approximately 48 hours, and the preparations shifted from negotiation to execution. The families began the specific work of organizing a wedding, which in Rome was a communal event, with obligations and rituals extending well beyond the immediate family. Invitations needed to be extended, food needed to be sourced and prepared, garlands needed to be made, a flute player needed to be hired. The gods needed to be informed, which required additional offerings. A Roman wedding was not something you organized in the last 2 weeks. It required planning, it required coordination, and it required, above all, a significant number of people all agreeing to show up at the same place at the same time, which in a city of 1 million people was its own small logistical achievement. The young woman at the center of all this preparation was undergoing something that had its own specific Roman name and ritual dimension. The night before her wedding, she dedicated the items of her childhood, her toys, her childhood bulla if she had worn one, her girl's toga, to the household gods. This was the formal end of one phase of life and the beginning of another, marked with religious ceremony, because Romans marked everything significant with religious ceremony. It was, when you sit with it for a moment, quite a profound gesture, the deliberate, ritualized setting aside of the objects of childhood on the night before everything changed, the toys placed on the shrine, the lamp burning, the city outside doing what it always did, completely indifferent to the weight of the moment inside this particular house. The groom's preparations were less ritually elaborate, but no less real. He was, in the days before the wedding, receiving the advice and counsel of older men who had done this, his father, his uncles, the family friends who had known him since childhood. The advice was practical and specific: how to manage a household, how to treat a wife with appropriate respect and authority, how to navigate the financial responsibilities that came with marriage and a dowry. Roman masculinity placed significant weight on the ability to manage one's household well. A man who could not manage his own house could not be trusted to manage anything in the public world, and the public world would judge accordingly. The wedding was the beginning of his most visible test.
There is something worth pausing on in all of this, something that cuts across all the law and the paperwork and the dowry negotiations and the auspice consulting and the careful social maneuvering. Two people, at the end of all of it, were going to stand together and make a commitment in front of everyone they knew. They may not have chosen each other in the way a modern person would understand that phrase. The choosing had been done largely by others, through processes they had limited control over. But they were going to stand there anyway, in the clothes that had been prepared, with the flowers that had been arranged, with the witnesses that had been gathered, and say the words. And in that moment, whatever had led to it, something real was happening. Something that the law could document but not fully contain. Something human.
Roman literature is full of weddings. They show up in poetry, in letters, in legal documents, in inscriptions on walls and tombs. And what strikes you, reading across all of them, is that the official description, the ceremony, the words, the ritual, is only ever part of the story. The rest of the story is in the details that slip through. The nervousness of a groom that a friend mentions in a letter. The description of how a bride looked walking through her own doorway for the last time. The small, unexpected moment of humor that broke the tension of a ceremony and made everyone laugh, including the priest. Life happened inside the ceremony, the way it always does. The Romans documented the ceremony. Life documented itself in the margins.
The betrothal is done. The date is set. The preparations are underway. Somewhere in the city tonight, in a household that has been changed by the events of the last several weeks, a lamp is burning later than usual. Someone is thinking. Not anxiously necessarily, or not only anxiously, but with the particular quality of thought that belongs to the night before things change. The toy on the shrine, the ring on the finger, the city outside, completely unchanged, doing exactly what it always does. The fountain still running, the neighbor's dog still making itself heard, the stars in exactly the same positions they were in last night and will be in tomorrow night. And in the middle of all of that constancy, one household on the edge of something new. Let that be the last thing you hold tonight. The edge of something new. The breath before. Let your own breath go slow and even. The city is sleeping. You can too. Sleep well.
The day is here. After all of it, the negotiations, the intermediaries, the careful social maneuvering, the dowry discussions, the auspice consulting, the garland making, the hiring of the flute player,
and approximately 1,000 small logistical decisions that nobody recorded because they were too busy actually making them, the wedding day has arrived. And ancient Rome, which had strong opinions about how most things should be done, had very strong opinions about how this particular day should go. There was a correct way to do a Roman wedding. There was an order. There were specific words. There were specific clothes. There were rituals that had been performed by Roman families for centuries and would continue to be performed for centuries more. Today, you are inside all of that. Take a breath. The flute player has arrived. We are beginning.
Let's start with what the bride is wearing, because the Roman wedding outfit was specific and deliberate, and every element of it meant something. She wore a white tunic, the tunica recta, woven in a particular way, belted at the waist with a special knot, the nodus herculaneus, the knot of Hercules. This knot was tied by the bride and could only be untied by the groom later that night, which was both a practical arrangement and a symbolic one that Romans appreciated for its clarity. Over the tunic, she wore a bright orange-yellow veil, the flammeum, which covered her head and fell to her shoulders, and which was the most visually distinctive element of the entire Roman bridal outfit. If you saw a woman in a flammeum in ancient Rome, you knew exactly what day it was for her. There was no ambiguity. Her hair was also prepared in a very specific way, divided into 6 sections and arranged using a special comb or the tip of a bent iron spear. The iron spear connection sounds alarming to modern ears, and historians have debated what it meant, with theories ranging from a reference to Mars, the god of war, to an ancient apotropaic tradition of warding off bad luck. Whatever the original reason, by the classical period it was simply what you did. You arranged the bride's hair with an iron implement. It was tradition. Romans had a deep respect for tradition. They continued doing things the traditional way long after anyone could clearly articulate why, which is actually a quality they share with most human cultures, including modern ones. Her shoes were orange, not because orange was her favorite color, but because orange, the same color as the flammeum, was the color associated with Roman brides, and the complete visual coherence of the bridal outfit, from veil to shoes, was a deliberate statement of status and ceremony. She also wore a wreath of flowers and herbs on her head, traditionally including marjoram, verbena, myrtle, and orange blossom, arranged over the veil. The combination of the orange veil, the flower wreath, the white tunic, and the Hercules knot meant that a Roman bride was visually unmistakable. She was dressed in the specific vocabulary of this moment, and everyone who saw her that day could read every word of it. The groom's outfit was considerably less elaborate by comparison, which is either a statement about Roman gender norms or simply a reflection of the fact that the ceremony, culturally, centered on the bride. He wore his best toga, the toga virilis, white and carefully arranged, and presented himself with the grooming and formality appropriate to one of the most significant public appearances of his life. He was not the visual centerpiece of the day. He was the destination. The ceremony moved toward him with the bride at its center. This arrangement, the bride as the visual and ceremonial focus, the groom as the fixed point she was moving toward, is one of the wedding traditions that has traveled most intact through 2,000 years of subsequent cultural history. The ceremony itself, the confereatio in its most formal version, reserved for patrician families, or the more common coemptio and usus forms for others, began in the bride's family home. This is important. The wedding started where she already was, in the house she had grown up in, surrounded by the people she had known all her life. It began with auspices, the consultation of omens to confirm that the gods approved of this marriage on this day. A professional haruspex might be present to read the signs. The results were, in practice, almost always favorable, because a Roman family that had done all the preparation necessary to reach this point was not going to have the day derailed by an unfavorable omen if they could possibly avoid it. The gods were generally understood to be on board.
Then the legal formalities. In a Roman wedding, the actual legal binding of the marriage was accomplished through words spoken before witnesses. 10 witnesses were required for the most formal ceremonies. The witnesses were not random. They were chosen carefully from the social networks of both families, people whose presence conferred status and whose testimony, if ever needed legally, would carry weight. 10 people standing in a room watching 2 families join. Their presence turned a private agreement into a public fact. This was, legally and socially, the moment the marriage became real. Everything before this was preparation. Everything after this was consequence.
The words spoken at a Roman wedding were simple and direct. The bride said, and these are among the very few actual words from a Roman wedding ceremony that survive in the historical record, "Ubi tu Gaius, ego Gaia." Where you are Gaius, I am Gaia. It is a formula of belonging and shared identity, using placeholder names the way a legal document uses blanks, your name here, her name here, and its simplicity is almost startling after all the elaborate preparation. Everything that had been negotiated and arranged and planned came down, in the end, to this: a woman standing in her family's house, saying she would go where her husband went. She would be what he was. She was, in that sentence, choosing, in the most constrained and supervised and prearranged sense of the word, to step from one life into another. After the ceremony, the wedding feast, the Cena Nuptialis, took place in the bride's family home, and this was, by any account, a serious celebration. Food, wine, music, entertainment, speeches, toasts, the kind of communal noise and laughter that a Roman household in full celebration mode could generate. The guests reclined on couches in the Roman style, ate in courses, drank well. Watered wine was the Roman norm, but this was a celebration, and the watering was probably modest, and conducted the social performance of celebrating this alliance with all the enthusiasm that Roman social life brought to events that mattered. The food was elaborate by the standards of the day. The conversation was louder than usual. The flute player earned whatever he was paid.
There were gifts. Wedding gifts in Rome were a social obligation, carried out with the Roman combination of genuine feeling and strategic awareness. You gave a gift that was appropriate to your relationship with the family, your own financial standing, and your assessment of what the alliance was worth celebrating. Practical items, household goods, cloth, oil, items for the new home, were common at all social levels. Wealthier families exchanged items of greater value. The gifts were noted. They were remembered. A particularly generous gift from a particular family meant something. A notably modest one from a family that could afford more also meant something. In Rome, gifts were a language, and everyone was fluent. Somewhere during the feast, as the afternoon moved toward evening, the mood shifted, because everyone knew what came next, and the transition from the feast to the next stage of the wedding was marked by its own rituals. The bride, at some point in the late afternoon or early evening, was formally separated from her mother. This moment, the bride's separation from her mother, is described in Roman sources with a specific Latin term, and it was understood to be genuinely emotional. Whatever the social and legal machinery around the day, this was the moment where it became viscerally real. She was leaving. The house she had lived in her whole life was no longer her house. The woman who had prepared her for this day was watching her go. The wedding procession, the deductio in domo mariti, the leading to the husband's house, was the most public part of the entire wedding and the part that most involved the wider community. The bride was escorted from her family's home to her new husband's home through the streets, accompanied by torchbearers, the flute player, the wedding guests, and typically at least some portion of the neighborhood who had come out to watch, because a Roman street never missed an opportunity for communal spectacle. 3 boys walked with her, traditionally 2 holding her hands and 1 carrying the wedding torch of hawthorn wood. She did not walk alone. She was delivered publicly with ceremony from one household to another. The procession moved through the streets of the city with noise and celebration, singing, jokes, the traditional songs that wedding parties sang, some of which were ribald enough that Roman writers noted them with varying degrees of amusement and disapproval. Nuts were thrown to children along the route, a tradition whose exact symbolic meaning was debated even by Romans at the time, which tells you that cultural traditions often outlast their explanations. The torches lit the way in the evening dark, the flames visible from the upper stories of the insulae as the procession passed below. People watched from windows. People came out to see. A Roman wedding procession was a public event in the most literal sense. It happened in the street, it involved the street, and the street responded. At the door of the groom's house, there was a specific ritual. The bride was carried over the threshold, not because she was incapable of stepping over it herself, but because it was considered bad luck to step on it with the wrong foot, and the carrying eliminated the risk entirely. This is remarkably another Roman wedding tradition that has persisted through 2,000 years into a modern practice most people perform without knowing where it comes from. The threshold was also smeared with oil and hung with wool, both symbols of a prosperous and productive household. The bride touched the doorposts, placed her hands on them, formally claiming the house as hers before entering. Small gestures, large meanings. That was Rome. Inside the house, the groom was waiting. He welcomed her with water and fire, 2 elements whose symbolic meaning in this context represented life and the hearth, the fundamental necessities around which a Roman household organized itself. She accepted both, formally, completing the transfer from her old household to her new one. In some ceremonies, she also placed a coin on the household shrine, an offering to the gods of this new home, and another coin was sent back to the gods of her old home. She was, in the most literal religious sense, changing households, changing gods, taking the lares of one family's shrine as her own. This was not metaphorical in ancient Rome. It was a genuine religious transition, and it was treated with genuine religious seriousness. The guests filled the new house, and the celebration continued. More food, more wine, more music, more of the communal noise of Roman celebration at full volume in a space that was probably not quite large enough for all of them. The speeches happened. Toasts to the couple, to the alliance, to the gods who had approved the match, to the families who had arranged it. The wedding torch was eventually extinguished, its ashes kept as a protective talisman for the new household. The flute player was, at some point, paid and released into the night. The guests eventually went home. The street outside went quiet. And in the house, which was now a different kind of house than it had been that morning, the long, complex, carefully managed process of beginning a life together began. Let's talk about the people who couldn't afford any of this. Because the wedding we've been describing, the flammeum, the 10 witnesses, the procession with torches, the elaborate feast, was the wedding of families with means. The overwhelming majority of Romans were not that. For ordinary Romans, the baker, the freedman, the family in the third-floor apartment, marriage was simpler, less ceremonial, and conducted with whatever resources were available. The legal requirements were more flexible at lower social levels. The important thing practically was the intention and the public acknowledgement. A couple who lived together, presented themselves as married, and were understood by their community to be married were, in Roman law, essentially married. The elaborate ceremony was for people who needed the elaborate ceremony. Most people got through it with considerably less production value and the same result.
And then there were the slaves. Slaves in ancient Rome could not legally marry. They could form partnerships that functioned like marriages in every practical sense: shared lives, shared children, shared domestic space. But these relationships had no legal standing, which meant they had no legal protection. A slave's partner could be sold away. Their children could be separated from them. The emotional and practical reality of these relationships was real and documented, but the law simply did not see them. This is one of the darkest corners of Roman domestic life, and it sat right alongside the elaborate ceremony and the flammeum and the Hercules knot without apparent contradiction, because Rome was a society that held extraordinary things alongside each other without resolving the tension between them, which is also, it should be said, a very human quality. What happened after all the guests went home and the street went quiet and the house settled into its new configuration? The marriage had begun. The legal and social machinery had done its work. Two families were now allied. A dowry had changed hands. The household gods had been honored. The witnesses had witnessed. And two people who may or may not have known each other well, who may or may not have had significant input into the choice that had brought them here, were now going to build a life together inside the framework that all of this had created. Roman marriages, for all their arranged alliance origins, produced real relationships. The historical record is full of evidence for this. The letters, the poetry, the funerary inscriptions where husbands and wives described each other in terms of genuine loss and genuine love. The beginning was arranged. What grew from it was human.
The torches are out. The street is quiet. The garlands at the doorway are still fresh, just barely, catching the moonlight. Inside, the house is still. The household shrine has its new offerings. The oil lamp burns low in the corner, the flame moving slightly in some air current too faint to feel. Somewhere in the city, the fountain is still running, the way it always runs, indifferent to what day it is. Tomorrow, the neighborhood will resume its ordinary conversation, now with one new piece of information added to its stock of knowledge. This household has changed. This alliance has been made. This door now opens onto a different arrangement than it did yesterday. But tonight, none of that matters yet. Tonight the lamp burns low. The city breathes. The new household is quiet in the way that new things are quiet, full of everything that hasn't happened yet. Let that quiet come into you now. Let the lamp go softer. Let the city go further away. You are almost there. Sleep well.
The wedding is over. The guests have gone home. The garlands at the door are doing what garlands do the morning after a celebration, hanging slightly less triumphantly than they did the night before, petals beginning their quiet descent to the threshold stones. The flute player has been paid. The witnesses have dispersed back into the city. And now, in the particular quiet of the morning after, the actual work begins. Because a Roman wedding was an ending and a beginning simultaneously, the end of the negotiation and the beginning of the thing the negotiation was for: a household, a partnership, a life conducted inside the specific social and legal framework that ancient Rome had built for this purpose. Welcome to Roman married life. It is more interesting than it sounds.
The first thing to understand about a Roman marriage is that it was, legally and practically, a partnership between two people with defined and different roles, and that both roles carried real authority within their respective domains. The husband, the pater familias of the new household, had legal authority over the household's public affairs, its finances, its legal standing, and its social representation in the world outside the door.
The wife, the domina, had authority over everything inside the door: the management of the household, the supervision of slaves, the running of the kitchen and the storage rooms and the domestic economy, the education of young children, and the social relationships that sustained the household from within. These were not lesser responsibilities dressed up as important ones. They were genuinely important, and a Roman household whose domina was bad at her job felt it in every practical dimension of daily life.
The physical space they shared deserves a slow look because the Roman home was designed in ways that encoded this division of responsibility into architecture. In a domus, the townhouse of a family with means, the atrium was the public-facing space where the husband received clients and conducted business and represented the household to the world. It was visible from the street, intentionally so. The tablinum, the home office off the atrium, was where he worked. These were his spaces. Further back in the house, past the tablinum, past the transition from public to private, were the rooms that were hers: the kitchen, the storage rooms, the sleeping rooms, the garden if there was one. The house was a map of the marriage, public in front and private behind, and the line between those two zones was understood by everyone who moved through it.
Let's talk about a typical morning in this household, because the rhythms of daily married life in ancient Rome were specific and worth following. The husband was up early. Romans were always up early, and his morning began with the salutatio, the morning greeting ritual in which clients, dependents, and social inferiors came to the house to pay their respects, ask for favors, receive patronage, and generally perform the elaborate daily maintenance of Roman social hierarchy. If he was a man of any standing at all, there were people waiting at his door before he was fully dressed. The salutatio was not optional. It was the performance of his social role, conducted every morning, by which his position in Rome's hierarchy was demonstrated and renewed.
While the salutatio was happening in the atrium, the domino was managing the other half of the morning simultaneously. She was giving instructions to the household slaves, directing the kitchen preparations, assigning tasks for the day, reviewing whatever needed reviewing, solving the small logistical problems that a Roman household generated constantly. A Roman household of any size was a genuinely complex operation. There were food supplies to manage, cloth to produce or purchase, accounts to keep, children to supervise, guests to prepare for, and the endless social obligations of neighborhood life to navigate. The domino was the operational center of all of this. She did not have time for the salutatio. She had a household to run.
Children arrived in most Roman marriages reasonably quickly. Roman society had strong expectations about family continuation, and the production of legitimate heirs was understood to be one of the central purposes of marriage. The birth of a child was a significant household event, marked with ceremony. The child was placed on the ground before the father, and if he picked it up, it was accepted into the family. If he did not, the child was exposed, left outside, either to die or to be taken in by someone else. This practice, exposure, was legal in ancient Rome and practiced most commonly when children were born with visible disabilities or when families simply could not afford another mouth. It sits very uncomfortably with modern sensibilities, and it should. It was a real practice. Rome was not a comfortable place for the vulnerable.
Assuming the child was accepted, which was the outcome in the overwhelming majority of cases, it entered the household with its own set of rituals. On the 8th day for girls and the 9th for boys, the dies lustricus, the day of purification, the child received its name in a ceremony involving the household gods, the family, and the protective bulla amulet that would be hung around the child's neck and worn until adulthood. The naming was significant because in Rome, having a name meant having a social identity, a place in the family record, a legal existence. The week between birth and the naming day was, in Roman understanding, the period during which the child's survival was least certain, and their social reality, therefore, appropriately provisional. If they made it to the 9th day, they were Roman. The relationship between husband and wife in a Roman household was,
And this surprises people who expect either cold transaction or modern romantic partnership, something considerably more varied and human than either extreme. Roman legal texts describe the relationship in formal terms of authority and obligation. Roman love poetry describes it in terms of passion and longing and rage. And the private letters and inscriptions that survive describe it in terms that feel immediately familiar: affection, irritation, worry, pride, the specific tenderness of people who have been through difficult things together. Pliny, writing to Calpurnia about missing her, is not performing. Marcus Aurelius, describing his wife in his private journal, is not performing. These were real people in real relationships that happened to have been arranged by their families and were conducted within the constraints of Roman law. The social life of a married Roman couple had its own structure. Dinner parties were now obligations of a different kind than they had been when you were unmarried. You hosted them as a couple, you attended them as a couple, and your joint social performance at these events was a direct reflection on the household you ran together. A wife who was visibly well-educated and able to converse appropriately was an asset at a dinner party. A husband who was witty and well-spoken reflected well on her choice, or her family's choice, of partner. The social evaluation never entirely stopped. It just became the evaluation of a partnership rather than an individual. You were now a unit. The unit was always being assessed. The Roman concept of concordia, harmony, agreement, was the ideal that Roman married life was supposed to embody and project. Concordia was not just an absence of conflict, it was an active quality, the visible alignment of two people working towards shared goals, managing a household well, raising children properly, maintaining the family's reputation, and presenting to the world the picture of a household that was functioning as a household should. Coins were minted with Concordia on them. Temples were dedicated to her. She was not an abstract virtue, but a practical one, the foundation on which Roman household stability, and by extension Roman social stability, rested. A household without Concordia was a household that everyone could see was in trouble, and everyone would be watching. What did they actually talk about, these Roman married couples, in the evenings when the clients had gone and the household was quiet? We have some windows into this through letters and literature, and the answer is the same things people have always talked about: money, children, the behavior of the neighbors, the political situation, which in Rome was always either interesting or alarming, usually both, what needed to be done tomorrow, what had gone wrong today, the specific running conversation of two people sharing a life, conducted in the particular shorthand that develops between people who know each other well enough to leave things out. The Roman details were different. The conversational texture was identical. The management of household slaves was one of the most constant and ethically complex dimensions of daily Roman married life. A Roman household of any means had slaves. A modest household might have 2 or 3. A wealthy one might have dozens. They were present in every room, for every conversation, in every moment of domestic life. They cooked the food, cleaned the floors, managed the children, ran the errands, carried the messages. They had no legal standing, no right to refuse, no protection beyond what their owners chose to provide. The Romans knew this was complicated. Roman writers wrote about it with more reflection than is sometimes acknowledged. But they did not dismantle the system. They lived inside it, as the people with power in it, and the traces of that fact are in every corner of Roman domestic history. Roman women had, within the constraints of their world, considerably more legal and financial independence than women in many subsequent historical periods. A Roman woman could own property in her own name. She could inherit, she could conduct business, she could initiate divorce, she could appear in court, though not as an advocate. The specific form of marriage most common by the classical period, the sine manu marriage, marriage without the hand, meant that a wife technically remained under her father's legal authority rather than her husband's, which paradoxically gave her more independence.
because a paterfamilias who lived far away, or was elderly, or died, had considerably less practical influence over her daily life than a husband living in the same house. Roman women were not free in the modern sense. They were not powerless in the ancient one.
The domina ran the household economy with real authority. She managed the accounts, directed the production of cloth. Spinning and weaving happened in Roman households at every social level, with the domina overseeing or participating in the work, and controlled the daily food budget. She decided what was served at dinner. She decided how the household's resources were allocated. She negotiated with vendors. She supervised the storage of grain and oil and wine. She kept the household functioning at the level of daily physical reality, which is the level at which everything else becomes possible. The philosophical public life her husband conducted in the Forum was, in a very practical sense, underwritten by the domestic management she was conducting behind the front door. Let's talk about what Roman couples did for enjoyment, because this is where the picture gets unexpectedly charming. Romans played board games. Archaeologists have found game boards scratched into stone surfaces throughout the Roman world, with pieces and dice nearby. They read aloud to each other. Reading silently was actually unusual in antiquity, and the shared experience of having a text read aloud was a common domestic pleasure for literate households. They kept pets, dogs especially, but also birds, fish, and ornamental ponds, and occasionally more exotic animals in wealthy households. They attended the games, the theater, the races together. They visited friends and received friends. They walked in the gardens. They did what people do when they have built a life together, and the initial strangeness of it has worn off. They inhabited it, comfortably, with all the small pleasures and irritations that inhabiting a shared life involves. The garden, the hortus, was for households that had one, a genuinely important domestic space. Not just decorative, but functional. Herbs and vegetables were grown there for the kitchen. Fruit trees provided seasonal food. And the physical space of a private garden in a city as dense as Rome was a genuine luxury. But beyond the practical, the garden was a place for the kind of conversation and quiet that the public rooms of the house didn't allow. Pliny wrote about his gardens with a specificity and pleasure that makes clear he considered them among the best things in his life. The garden was where the city stopped pressing in, where the clients and the social obligations and the performance of public life could be temporarily set aside. In a marriage, it was where you could be simply two people in a quiet space, rather than a household projecting concordia to the world. Disease and death were constant presences in Roman household life in ways that a modern person, insulated by medicine from most of what killed Romans regularly, finds difficult to fully absorb. Infant mortality was high. Adult mortality from things now easily treated was common. A Roman married couple who had been together for 20 years had almost certainly lost children, possibly more than one, had nursed each other through serious illness, and had watched people they loved, parents, siblings, friends, die at ages that modern medicine would consider premature. This shared experience of loss and survival was part of the texture of Roman marriage. The funerary inscriptions where Roman spouses describe each other, carissima, dearest, dulcissima, sweetest, benemerenti, well-deserving, were written by people who knew what it meant to have kept someone in a world that took people early and often. The concept of the ideal Roman wife had a specific vocabulary that shows up repeatedly in those funerary inscriptions and in the literature. Lanifica, wool worker; domiseda, homekeeper; pudica, modest; frugi, frugal; chaste. These were the virtues that Roman society publicly celebrated in wives, and they tell you something about what Roman society officially valued. But the private record, the letters, the poetry, the dedications, adds other things: intelligence, wit, loyalty, courage, the ability to manage difficult situations with calm and competence. The official vocabulary and the actual experience of Roman marriage were, as with most of Roman life, related but not identical. People valued more than they publicly said they valued. They always do. A Roman marriage, at its best, was a genuine partnership conducted within a framework that modern people would find unequal and constraining. It had legal asymmetries that favored the husband, it had social expectations that limited the wife, it had been initiated by a process that prioritized family strategy over personal feeling. And yet, within all of that, real human beings built real lives. They knew each other, they relied on each other, they were changed by each other in the ways that people who share a life are always changed. The framework was Roman. The humanity inside it was just humanity, the same kind that has always been trying to build something lasting inside whatever framework it finds itself in. The house is quiet now. The salutatio is long over. The clients dispersed back into the city with whatever they came for or without it. The kitchen is cleaned. The children are asleep in the back rooms, breathing in the total, effortless way that only children sleep. The household shrine has its evening offering, the small flames steady in the still indoor air. The garden is dark outside the open doorway, the smell of herbs coming in with the cool night air. 2 people are in the last room still lit, doing what people do at the end of a day. Unwinding from it, talking through it, setting it aside. The lamp between them is warm. The city outside is doing what Rome always does at this hour, not going fully quiet because Rome never fully goes quiet, but going quieter. The cartwheels fewer, the voices further apart, the fountain still running the way it always runs. Let all of that reach you now, through 2,000 years of distance, and feel like what it is, the end of an ordinary day, in an extraordinary city, a long time ago. Let your breath slow. Let the lamp go dim. Sleep well.
All right, we have followed this Roman household through the negotiations and the ceremony and the wedding procession and the morning salutatio and the garden evenings and the children's naming days. We have watched Concordia do its work. But this is a complete history of Roman love and marriage, and a complete history has to include the part that the wedding poems didn't cover, because Roman marriages ended, not infrequently, not with great shame, not always with great drama, but with a regularity that would surprise people who assume that arranged marriages in ancient societies were permanent by definition. Rome had divorce. Rome had scandal. Rome had the specific, complicated social landscape of people trying to navigate what came after. Tonight, we go there. Settle in. This part of the story is just as human as the rest of it.
Let's start with the basic legal fact, because it is genuinely striking. Roman divorce was, by the standards of almost any subsequent historical period, remarkably straightforward. Either party could initiate it. Yes, either party. The husband could divorce his wife. The wife could divorce her husband. There was no requirement for a specific legal cause in the classical period. No fault needed to be proven. No court needed to be involved. The marriage was dissolved by the expression of intent, witnessed appropriately, and that was essentially it. The formula was simple. The party initiating the divorce said, in effect, take your things and go. Tuas res tibi habeko. Take your things for yourself. 3 words. 2,000 years ago. The marriage was over.
Now, simple in legal principle did not mean simple in practice, because the dowry, remember the dowry, the careful negotiations, the lawyers, the documentation, had to be returned. When a Roman marriage ended, the wife's dowry came back to her or to her family with specific rules about what deductions the husband was entitled to make depending on the circumstances of the divorce. If he had been at fault, if he had committed adultery, for example, or had treated her badly, the deductions were limited. If she had been at fault, the deductions were larger. The Romans had turned even the emotional wreckage of a failed marriage into a legal accounting problem, which is either admirable or deeply Roman, depending on your perspective, probably both. The most common stated reason for divorce in the Roman historical record, at least among the upper classes, whose divorces are the ones we know most about, was political rather than personal. Rome's elite families used marriage as alliance, as we have established at considerable length, and when the political landscape shifted, alliances that had been advantageous became liabilities, and marriages were dissolved and new ones contracted with the new landscape in mind. Julius Caesar divorced his wife Pompeia not because he believed she had done anything wrong, but because, as he famously said, Caesar's wife must be above suspicion, a standard of optics so demanding that innocence was insufficient. The divorce was a political calculation. The marriage had been a political calculation. The system was consistent, at least.
Cicero divorced his wife Terentia after 30 years of marriage when he was in his 60s and married a much younger woman named Publilia shortly afterward. His letters from this period suggest a man in genuine emotional difficulty. The divorce from Terentia after 3 decades was not a clean or simple thing, whatever the legal formula said, and his second marriage was apparently not a success. His daughter Tullia, whom he loved deeply and who had been a constant source of pride and comfort throughout his life, died shortly after, and his letters from that period are among the most raw expressions of grief in all of Latin literature. Cicero, the most famous lawyer in Rome, the man who could argue any case, had no argument against this. He just had the loss. Women initiated divorce too, and the historical record has enough examples of this that it clearly was not exceptional. A Roman woman with a living father, still technically under his legal authority in a sine monu marriage, could, with her father's support, dissolve her marriage relatively straightforwardly. A woman without that support had a harder path, but it was not an impossible one. There are records of Roman women leaving marriages that were making them miserable, returning to their families' households, recovering their dowries, and eventually remarrying. The system that had constrained them also, in this one specific way, gave them an exit. It was not a comfortable exit, and it came with significant social costs, but it existed. The social costs of divorce for a Roman woman were real and specific. A divorced woman was not ruined. Roman society was considerably more pragmatic about remarriage than many subsequent cultures, but she occupied a complicated social position. She was between households, which in Rome was an uncomfortable place to be. Her reputation needed careful management. The reasons for the divorce would be discussed, analyzed, and distributed through the social networks of the city with the efficiency we have already established Roman gossip possessed. Whether she was seen as the wronged party or the initiating party mattered. Whether the divorce had been amicable or contentious mattered. Whether her family supported her publicly mattered. Everything in Rome was a matter of how it was seen by the people who were always watching. Adultery in Roman marriage was treated with a legal and social asymmetry that was stark even by ancient standards. A husband's infidelity was not, under Roman law, the same offense as a wife's infidelity. A wife's adultery, adulterium, was a serious legal matter that could result in criminal prosecution under the laws of Augustus, who took a very particular interest in regulating Roman sexual morality as part of his broader program of moral restoration. A convicted adulteress lost half her dowry and a third of her property, was banned from remarrying a freeborn Roman, and was publicly disgraced. The husband in the same situation faced no equivalent legal penalty. The double standard was not subtle, it was built into the statute. Augustus's moral legislation, the Lex Julia de Adulteris and the Lex Julia de Maritandis Ordinitis, passed around 18 BC, represents one of the most ambitious attempts in Roman history to use law to regulate private behavior, and its reception tells you something interesting about the gap between official Roman values and actual Roman practice. The laws required Romans to marry, penalized those who remained unmarried or childless, and criminalized adultery. They were, from the beginning, imperfectly enforced, widely evaded, and persistently unpopular among exactly the upper-class Romans whose behavior they were primarily targeting. Augustus eventually had to exile his own daughter Julia under these laws.
She had become a figure of considerable scandal, which was either a demonstration of his commitment to the principle or the most painful advertisement for the limits of legislation ever recorded.
Scandal in Roman public life was both more and less damaging than in modern life, in ways that are genuinely interesting to think about. More damaging because reputation, dignitas, was a real and practical asset, and damage to it had concrete consequences in business, politics, and social standing. Less damaging because Roman society, despite its official moral vocabulary, had a fairly sophisticated understanding that the official story and the actual story were rarely identical, and that the performance of virtue was sometimes more important than the practice of it. A Roman who managed their public image well could sustain a private life of considerable complexity without the two interfering with each other, provided they were careful. Many were. Rome was full of people being careful. Remarriage after divorce was common and socially acceptable in Rome, particularly for men and for women who were still of childbearing age. Rome had a pragmatic attitude toward the continuation of family lines and the maintenance of social alliances, and a divorced or widowed person who did not remarry was, in the eyes of Roman law under Augustus, actually subject to penalties. The state had opinions about your marital status. Specifically, it had opinions about whether you were contributing to the production of Roman citizens, and if you were not, it intended to make that choice mildly inconvenient through inheritance restrictions and social limitations. Rome was not a society that left private decisions entirely private. It never had been. Widowhood was a more complex social position than divorce, because it carried none of the reputational risk of divorce while still presenting the practical problem of a person between households. A Roman widow of means, particularly one who had outlived her paterfamilias as well as her husband, could, in the classical period, achieve a degree of legal and financial independence that was unusual for Roman women. She might control significant property. She might conduct her own legal affairs. She might choose whether and whom to remarry with considerably more personal agency than she had had the first time. History has examples of Roman widows who were genuinely powerful figures, who managed estates, conducted business, influenced politics through their networks, and did all of it within the nominal framework of a society that officially considered women unsuited to these roles. The children of a dissolved Roman marriage occupied a legally specific position. Under Roman law, children belonged to the father's household. Paternal custody was the default, not maternal. In practice, arrangements varied, and there is evidence that mothers maintained relationships with their children even after marriages ended, but the legal presumption was paternal. A Roman mother who divorced or was divorced from her husband did not automatically keep her children the way a modern custody arrangement might provide. This was one of the most significant practical constraints on a Roman woman's freedom to leave a bad marriage, the knowledge that the children might stay behind. Rome, generous in some ways to women, was not generous in this one. Let's talk about the people who never married, because they existed in Rome too, even within a society that officially disapproved of them. Some men remained unmarried for extended periods by choice, absorbed in their careers, their philosophical commitments, their other relationships. Some women, particularly the Vestal Virgins, the 6 priestesses who tended the sacred flame of Vesta, were not permitted to marry during their 30 years of service, and occupied a unique social position that gave them legal privileges unavailable to other women in exchange for the vow of chastity that defined their office. The Vestals were among the most legally independent women in Rome. They could own property, make wills, and appear in court without a male guardian. Celibacy, in their specific case, was freedom of a particular kind. The Vestal Virgins deserve their full moment because they are one of the most fascinating institutions in Roman religious and social life. 6 women, chosen between the ages of 6 and 10 from patrician families, serving for 30 years as the guardians of the eternal flame in the Temple of Vesta in the Forum. If the flame went out, it was a catastrophe, a sign of divine displeasure, requiring elaborate expiation. The Vestals were responsible for ensuring it never did. In exchange for this responsibility and their vow of chastity, they received honors extended to almost no other Roman women: a front-row seat at the games, the right to free slaves by touching them, legal independence, and the general reverence of the city. They were untouchable in both senses, sacred and protected. A man who physically harassed a Vestal faced the death penalty. Rome took this seriously. What happened when a Vestal broke her vow? The penalty was by any standard severe. She was entombed alive in an underground chamber with a small amount of food and a lamp, left to die without the city technically having shed her blood, because shedding the blood of a Vestal was itself a religious violation. This happened rarely. The historical record documents perhaps 10 cases over the entire history of the institution. But the fact that it was the penalty tells you how seriously Rome took the Vestal's chastity. It was not a personal moral matter. It was a civic one. The purity of the Vestal was understood to be directly connected to the well-being of Rome. Her failure was Rome's failure. The city paid for it. The penalty was proportionate to that understanding, in Rome's own terrible logic. Back to ordinary Romans picking up the pieces after a marriage ended. The practical reality of post-divorce life in Rome was, for most people, considerably less dramatic than the legal framework might suggest. People returned to their families' households. They waited the appropriate period. They managed their reputations through the usual channels. They received advice from their mothers, who had seen this before, and from their fathers, who had opinions. And then, when the timing seemed right and the social landscape had settled, they began again. New intermediaries, new conversations, new soundings sent through new networks. The process that had produced the first marriage repeated with the accumulated knowledge of one marriage's experience added to it. Whether that made it easier or harder probably depended entirely on the specific person. One thing that strikes you, looking across the full landscape of Roman marriage, the negotiations and the ceremonies and the concordia and the divorces and the scandals and the remarriages, is how relentlessly social it all was. There was almost no dimension of Roman married life that was purely private. The wedding was public, the salutatio was public, the dinner parties were public performances. The divorce was known within days. The remarriage was assessed by everyone with an opinion, which in Rome was everyone. Romans lived their entire intimate lives inside a community that was paying close attention, and they knew it, and they performed accordingly, while simultaneously, in the gardens and the private rooms and the letters sent to trusted friends, being exactly as messy and complicated and fully human as people always are when nobody officially important is watching. And yet, despite the surveillance, despite the legal asymmetries, despite the arranged beginnings and the politically motivated endings, and the Augustus-era legislation trying to turn private life into a matter of public policy, love happened. Stubbornly, persistently, in the spaces the system left open, love happened. The funerary inscriptions prove it. The letters prove it. The poetry, which survived because it was too good to lose, proves it. Romans fell for each other. They missed each other when they were apart. They were devastated when they lost each other. They wrote it down, in stone and on papyrus and in wax, because they needed to say it somewhere. 2,000 years later, we can still read it. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, quite a lot. The city is quiet now. Somewhere in Rome tonight there is a household in the middle of something difficult, a marriage at one of its harder passages, or an ending that hasn't yet found its form, or a beginning that is tentative and uncertain and carrying the weight of whatever came before. And somewhere else in the same city, on the same night, there is a household that has found its rhythm, the morning salutatio and the kitchen management and the garden evenings and the children sleeping in the back room. A household that has turned an arranged alliance into something that actually works, that actually feels like home. Both are Rome. Both are real. The difficult one and the settled one exist 3 streets apart, under the same stars, beside the same fountains, in the same city that holds all of it without judgment and without resolution, the way cities always do. Let that be the last thing tonight, the city holding all of it, the lamp going low, the fountain running. You are almost gone. Sleep well.